Hi, everybody. So this week we were talking about family systems theories. Now I'm going to let you know that, one, this will be a little bit longer video. I'm going to try to be relatively quick with it, but there's just a lot to cover. This is sort of just going to be a general introduction to the large umbrella of family systems work, because there are multiple approaches to systemic work, and there's multiple people that have really played a role in its development. But these are three individuals here: Virginia Satir, who's actually a Wisconsin native, Murray Bowen, and Salvador Minuchin, who have played a very key role in applying systemic work to psychotherapy. Um, and they all kind of take on different approaches in how they do their work. But ultimately, just know that systemic work is a kind of a broad, diverse field, and the reasons why these emerged, which you can think about the theories that we've learned about so far, is that they've been very based on the individual, right? And so there were some limitations around that. And so these theories started to emerge kind of when some of the psychiatric hospitals began to close and people were actually going back home. There's maybe a lot of problems that would emerge again. And people just recognized that there were some limitations with that. And because these theories talk about how we are products of our environment. And so why not try to work with the environment rather than solely with the individual? Another nice thing about these theories is that since it does take into consideration more of the system, it means it's more collectivistic, which the other theories we talked about were very much on the individual level. And these allow for a little bit more sort of cultural diversity, especially when we have many cultures that are collectivistic in their approaches. So anyway, and you'll also begin to hear some ways that this ties in a little bit to what we'll talk about next week, which is feminist and sociocultural. While these theories primarily talk about, the family systems theories talk about the nuclear family, those other theories, feminism and sociocultural, talk about larger systems, right? Governmental, macro types of things. Just keep that in mind. Understand that with family systems theories, that context is vital. The more that we can understand the person within their environment, the roles that they get into, just how important that actually is, because that helps us learn more about the person. And so recognize, though, too, that in order to do systemic work, it isn't so much about how many people are actually in the room. It's more about the way that you think about them and the ways that we develop rules, the way we develop roles, and how we begin to adapt and fit within those systems. So some central concepts here. Systems, it's a set of interrelated parts that behaves together as a coherent unit, right? And the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So that should sound familiar to you. That should sound very much like Gestalt. This whole idea that we're trying to understand all of these different parts. Gestalt kind of played it as more of the individual. And here, the systems theories are basically saying that we have to look at all of the parts of the system in order to understand the individual. And so a nice kind of analogy with this is sort of this idea of thinking about the system being an engine. Right? If we look at all of these different parts that make up engines, the belts, the spark plugs, the filter, on their own, they're not necessarily doing very much. But then when they come together, they help the engine run. Right? And so we have to try to find ways to look at each individual, but then how do they come together to work within the system? And there's a strong belief that our behaviors are very goal-directed. And this means then that our systems that we're a part of are also goal-directed. We're trying to essentially create some sort of sense of homeostasis and just have some sort of balance or equilibrium in the way that we're living our lives. And so we have to try to understand the goals in order to understand the relationships amongst those different parts. So if we can begin to think a bit more about what is the unit, the family, trying to accomplish, we can then pay attention to those relationships and how they seem to influence one another, and is it helping them achieve their goal or not? And so kind of a simple example of this too is if you think about the wave at a sporting event, for any of you that are sport fans, right? If one individual was sitting there just putting their hands up in the air, it looks a little strange, right? But then as more people begin to start to do it, and you get the whole group and the whole stand, everybody to go around and create the wave, it actually begins to make sense, right? Because now all of a sudden, here's people uniting for their team, and it's a way to kind of encourage their team to, do better and to show that people are staying involved and active. But if it's one person doing it by themselves, it looks a little strange. But then as soon as you get the whole group to do it, it actually makes a lot more sense. Now, keep in mind then that for systems theories that there's just a lot of layers, okay? And we're all embedded or enmeshed, much like this mobile here, right? Because if you were to address the smallest mobile here on the bottom, like the little piece, if you tapped that, it would still affect the whole mobile. It would shake, it would shift. And so that we have just multiple layers within the systems that we're a part of. So there's the subsystem, which are the individuals and kind of how that works. And there's could be a subsystem within ourselves, but then we also have to fit within the system there, within a larger system like our family. And then there's the super systems, which is, the extended families that were part of the community, culture. And so family systems approaches would take some of these things into consideration, but it's more so feminist theory and sociocultural that really look at broader, bigger macro supra systems that exist. But ultimately, we're trying to develop some kind of homeostasis in order to have that balance, like the mobile there. But of course, the bigger the system, the more complex that it's going to be. The more things you're trying to take into consideration. So just be aware of that. Now, for system rules, there are a lot of unwritten procedures and ways of functioning that we all learn and develop in some kind of way. It's pretty fascinating to watch actually how these things begin to emerge. Even if you think about your very first day in the class, all of you found some kind of seat and decided to face a certain way and waited for me to show up in class and begin and get things rolling. Yeah, you learned that early on and maybe were told some of that kind of stuff, but I didn't tell you to do that. You didn't know that that was going to be my rule necessarily, but yet it became the unwritten rule. And that's sort of your role as a student and my role as the instructor. And ultimately, it's just a matter of trying to find ways to create that stable patterns of interacting. You learn to find the patterns that begin to emerge and recognize that there can be sort of this cycle that happens. But we can also sometimes then really define those roles and the ways that we're functioning. But ultimately, keep in mind that it's a circular process. So we don't usually move within a straight line of things because then that's how patterns emerge clearly, but then that's how we develop our roles and the rules. And so just another quick example is like a teacher scolds Carol, right? Carol was misbehaving. And then Carol just ends up withdrawing because she feels ashamed. She doesn't quite know what to do. She felt like she got into trouble, right? But then the teacher decides to comfort Carol, and Carol then begins to get clingy towards the teacher. And then eventually, maybe the teacher scolds Carol again for being too clingy, and then Carol withdraws. But then the teacher decides to reach out and comfort again. And so that cycle would likely repeat. And now the reality is we don't know where to start with all of that. There's not like any right point. It's more recognizing where the pattern is and can we then begin to disrupt the pattern. So honestly, where to start? Anywhere within that cycle. Roots of problems, okay? So I was mentioned earlier about how the family systems theories looks more at the system rather than just the individual. And so this means that we develop symptoms when things aren't working out, when the rules don't make sense, when the roles aren't being filled, or maybe we don't feel like it's an appropriate role for us anymore, the rules don't make sense to us, and we then begin to act out or lash out. Perhaps maybe you have a child who begins to scream and yell all the time, and the mother's on the phone and she just doesn't seem to acknowledge the child, or she's so fed up and then she screams and yells, and then the child begins to get more upset and pull away. And so it would maybe be a matter of trying to help shift that. But so ultimately, it's a matter of recognizing that the ways that we're engaging aren't quite working. And so the system begins to dissolve, and then that's when the symptoms begin to emerge. And the symptoms begin to emerge in an effort to try to maintain that homeostasis, but sometimes it's not always working out. Okay? And people are trying to adapt to those new roles. And so then that's how the problems begin to emerge. They're carrying too much weight. And so when working with the families, you're not assessing why. We don't care so much about why these things are going on. You don't have to look at the past or even just why people became the way that they are, but you're paying attention to more of what's going on. And so that means you're trying to find ways to then really identify those rules and the roles. So you're trying to pay attention to the patterns that seem to be emerging. You want to understand the impact then this has, right? So if mom begins to yell at the child who's yelling and screaming to try to get her attention, how does that impact the kid? Does the kid begin to pull away and shut down and recognize that maybe that's not the best way to get mom's attention? Or does the kid begin to lash out and act in other ways? And so this means that we're doing a lot of observations as a clinician. We're having to actually try to interact and join in with the system. and then doing some circular questioning, basically coming back around to pieces again, figuring out where the patterns are and how they seem to emerge. And so ultimately we blend ourselves in with the intervention. Because we're joining in with this system, there's no way to really separate ourselves, not entirely at least. And so that way we kind of find ways to engage with them. But so in order to help create the change, we have to change the system. We have to alter the rules that are existing. We have to alter the roles that people are getting into. Even when there's one person in the room, if they're going to be talking about a role that they seem to take on, gosh, well, when I get yelled at by my parents, I actually just want to fight back and yell at them. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about some other ways that you can maybe take on some roles that look different. And so a change anywhere within the system invites a systemic change, right? So if we were to take this mobile and we were to change one piece, that's going to change the balance of it in any kind of which way. And so then you want to try to find another way to balance the other end out. And so you want to try to create the change, and just changing one little piece is believed to then create change. And even though there's going to be some sort of pressure to maintain homeostasis, there could be new symptoms that emerge, but hopefully through the restructuring, and people can balance things out, the symptoms that would then begin to subside. And so systemic change, there's sort of three main ways in which people kind of view how to go about doing systemic change. So there's the sort of the communication patterns, and this could be verbal as well as nonverbal, right? The person who ends up not being home a lot of the time is communicating a lot to the family in some ways, right? But this could also very much be that yelling that was happening at each other and what's being said through all of that. It's not, again, not always about what's being said, but how it's also being said. But then there's also a focus on the rules and the interactions that happen with those rules. And then also sometimes the meaning making. So we hear some existential components with that as well. What does that mean to you to hear that from your mom and your dad? How do you begin to interpret that, and how do you begin to kind of see yourself with all of that? And so our role as the counselor is to be very involved. I think oftentimes people think as therapy very much being in a chair and kind of just engaging in conversation. I don't believe that even with an individual, our therapy should solely be that way. I think there's usefulness for it, but I think we need to try to find ways to make it come alive, be experiential. And systems work definitely allows for more of that to happen, because we are joining in with the system, and then we're trying to actually change the system within the room. And so we can get very active, and we can actually tell people to sit in different spots or rearrange the room in some kind of ways. We ask them to take on different roles, or even do some kind of role play in order to help them engage, interact, increase their awareness. And so it can have some similarities to Gestalt aspects, but we want to make sure that all members are involved in some kind of way. And I'm going to kind of show you what this can look like a little bit in class. But we are ultimately trying to find ways to connect and maintain some kind of connection. And we want to try to have some sort of use of our power as a counselor to be intentional with the types of interventions, the ways we're setting things up for everybody. Some other methods that kind of come up are genograms and ecomaps, which are essentially in-depth family trees to try to help recognize relationships and patterns that seem to emerge, and it's kind of drawing things out. Sculpting is people physically sculpting themselves in a way that represents their experience of things. But then there could be a paradox, which is sort of like Alfred Adler's spitting in the soup, which is the idea of really saying, gosh, if this did not happen, what would this be like? I'm trying to think of a good example. So maybe let's say it's a very traditional where it's a husband expecting dinner to be ready when he gets home from work. Let's just say it's kind of a terrible example. So the paradox might be, just what if he had to make his own dinner, or what if just dinner wasn't ready when he did get home? What would that mean to him? What would that look like? How would that kind of pan out? Just putting that paradox out there. So those are the main pieces that I want to really begin to talk about when it comes to systemic work. So if I'm going to try to summarize this, ultimately systems say that we are products of our environment, and that we learn from our environment, and so we take on certain roles and we develop certain rules, whether they're spoken or not, in order to engage and interact in effort to try to help the group, the system, maintain homeostasis. But if we're then all of a sudden out of balance, we are trying to find ways to compensate, but that might create symptoms. And so it's our job as the counselor to redefine the rules, redefine the roles, and get engaged with the family or the system in any kind of which way we can in order to change all of those things. So I hope that can be like the easy takeaway for the systems approaches. And I would suggest that if this seems interesting to you, to really read up more on Satir's work, Bowen's work, or Minuchin's work. Okay, thanks everybody.